We're putting this initiative on the ballot to call attention to the issue of flexible work time because it's a very important issue that few people are talking about. Most flexible work time laws are meant to let people balance their work and family obligations, but there are also important benefits to the environment and to employment. Despite all these benefits, the great majority of American workers do not have the choice of working shorter hours, because in today's economy, most part-time jobs have low pay, no benefits, and no chance of advancement. The economist Juliet Schor calculated that if the average American male worker cuts his hours 50%, he would cut his earnings by 80%, because part-time jobs currently do not pay as well. Most people cannot afford the massive loss of earnings that comes with today's part-time jobs, so they're forced to take standard full-time jobs where they have no choice of work hours. To begin with, we have to make it clear that there are two types of laws that allow flexible work time. Compulsory laws allow employees to request shorter work hours and require the employer to grant the request unless the employer can show that it would create operational problems. The best known examples are the Dutch and German laws, which have been successful for over a decade. Right to request laws allow employees to request shorter work hours and require the employer to respond to the request, but they do not require the employer to grant the request. The best known is the British law called the soft touch law, which applies only to caregivers, such as the parents of preschool children. Vermont recently passed a similar law that applies to all employees, and San Francisco recently passed one that applies to caregivers. A similar law that applies to all employees was introduced in Congress in 2007 and has been reintroduced since. It had many co-sponsors, including a senator from Illinois at the time it was introduced, named Barack Obama. Our initiative calls on the City of Berkeley to pass a right to request law modeled on the Working Families Flexibility Act. It also has the city write letters to the state and federal governments asking them to pass right to request laws and to give government employees the right to request part-time work. It will be easier to pass right to request laws than compulsory laws, and right to request laws do work. One study looked at requests during a 2-year period, and it found that in the Netherlands, which has a compulsory law, employers refused 10% of requests. And in the UK, which has a right to request law, employers refused 11% of requests. Right to request laws work almost as well as compulsory laws. We're calling on the City Council to fine-tune the law based on public input so it works for both business and labor. For example, small businesses should be exempt because their owners generally do all the hiring and firing, and dealing with these requests would be burdensome for them. We'll start off with the obvious benefits of flexible work time to the family. Our standard 40-hour work week dates back to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, a time when the typical American family was made up of a working husband and a stay-at-home wife. Today, most families with children do not have a stay-at-home parent. In these families, 90% say that there's a conflict between their work and family obligations. There's no need to go into much detail because everyone realizes that the family has changed and it's now difficult for many parents to balance work and family obligations. Today's working parents need more flexibility than working fathers needed in 1938. Next, let's look at the second major benefit of flexible work time, the benefit to the environment. It's just common sense that if people choose to work less and consume less, they'll also pollute less. Flexible work time would give people the choice of downshifting economically. To use a slogan of the shorter work time movement, people could choose to have more time instead of more stuff. Of course, many people are on the edge economically and cannot afford to work less, but there could be a significant environmental benefit if people who are more affluent chose to consume less in order to be able to work less. Shorter work time could slow growth of greenhouse gas emissions, which would give us more time to adopt cleaner technologies and make it more likely that we'll succeed in controlling global warming. A study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that if Americans worked as few hours as Western Europeans, it would lower our greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. The effect is even more dramatic if we think about which model of work time the developing nations follow. Other studies confirm that shorter work time is good for the environment. For example, there's a study named Hours of Work and the Ecological Footprint of Nations, which found that shorter hours reduce ecological footprint by even more than you would expect based on reduced income and consumption, because long work hours and time scarcity lead to more ecologically damaging lifestyle choices, such as eating fast food rather than cooking for yourself. In the short term, a relatively small number of people would choose shorter work hours, and there would be a relatively small environmental benefit. If we look ahead to the coming century, we can imagine that there might be a powerful movement towards simpler living, as people realize how much damage consumerism is doing to the world's environment. But a movement towards simpler living will never become widespread as long as people don't even have the choice of working shorter hours, choosing more time instead of more stuff. Now, let's look at the third major benefit of flexible work time. In addition to benefiting families and the environment, it has the economic benefit of creating more jobs, as employers hire more people to backfill for those who choose shorter hours. Of course, well-paid workers are more likely to choose shorter hours because they're the ones who can afford it, so these new jobs are likely to be well-paid jobs. The Dutch consider increased part-time work the cause of what they call the employment miracle of the 1990s, when unemployment fell from 13% in the mid-1980s to 6.7% in 1986, the lowest level in Western Europe at that time. Government jobs alone can make a big difference. If all American civilian federal employees had a choice of work time, and if they chose to work as much as the average German employee, it would create about 500,000 new jobs as government hired new people to fill in for the shorter hours. This leads to a fundamental point about our economy. New technology increases what economists call the productivity of labor. As technology improves, the average worker can produce more in an hour. During the 20th century, productivity increased by an average of about 2.3% a year, which means that the average American worker produced almost 10 times as much per hour in 2000 as in 1900. New technology eliminates work by substituting machines for people, and we can make up for the jobs lost in three ways: by producing more, by working less, or by some combination of both. During most of our history, we did both. In 1840, the standard full-time job was 6 days per week, 12 hours per day, a total of 72 hours per week. Unions fought for shorter hours just as hard as they fought for higher wages, and a century later, the standard full-time job had declined by almost half to 40 hours per week. We can see in the graph that actual hours worked declined pretty steadily from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution through the 1920s. Then hours went down sharply because of the Great Depression. Then they went up sharply during World War II. But then, after World War II, American work hours stopped declining. Today, we still have the standard 40-hour work week of the 1950s. This chart shows the standard work week in manufacturing, which is interesting because we have the best historical statistics about manufacturing, and because manufacturing jobs are virtually all full-time, so this chart is a record of what a full-time job meant over history. Today, we tend to think that a full-time job means 40 hours per week, period. But the chart shows very clearly that the 40-hour job was an invention of post-war America. If work time had kept declining at its historical rate, A full-time job today would be a bit less than 30 hours a week, and our ecological footprint would be more than 25% smaller than it is. In Western Europe, work hours are still declining. This graph shows the average annual hours for all workers, full and part-time. France and Germany both had much longer hours than the United States in 1950, but now have much shorter hours. France is known for its short work hours because of its battles over the 35-hour week, but Germany actually has shorter hours than France. It's interesting to compare Germany and the United States because the difference in output depends almost entirely on the difference in work time. Germany's per capita GDP is 80% of America's, and their average work time is 82% of America's. Conventionally, you might think Germany's economy would be weaker because of its lower per capita GDP, but it's more successful in many ways than ours. We can see that Germany has a lower national debt, a higher household savings rate, and lower unemployment, and their trade balance shows surpluses year after year, while ours shows deficits. These numbers show that a country can be successful economically with shorter work hours and choice of work hours, like Germany. Germans also have a much smaller ecological footprint than Americans. In part, this is because of their strong efforts to promote clean energy, but their shorter work hours contribute about as much as their cleaner economy. In fact, some of the most successful economies in Northern Europe have the world's shortest work hours: the Netherlands, Norway, Germany, Belgium, and Denmark. I mention this because people often say that France's shorter work hours are hurting its economy, but they don't realize that these very successful economies have shorter hours than France. And which economy has the longest work hours in the Eurozone? Greece, with Europe's most problematic economy. The Netherlands has the shortest work hours of all, 80% as much as the United States. And this is largely because they began creating more part-time jobs in the 1980s and guaranteed employees the right to choose part-time work in 2000. In 2010, 48.5% of Dutch workers were part-time, and the number was growing. Ruud Lubbers, who was Dutch Prime Minister when they began to promote part-time work, has said, "The Dutch are not aiming to maximize gross national product per capita. Rather, we're seeking to attain a high quality of life. Because they have the choice, the Dutch can work part-time if they think it will improve their quality of life." This is the fourth benefit of choice of work time, a better quality of life. People can choose the work-life balance that gives them the most satisfaction. To summarize, the most urgent reason we need flexible work time is to let people balance their work and family obligations. Being forced to take the 40-hour jobs of the 1950s is a real hardship to many of today's families. I expect that most people will support this initiative because they see how much it will help working parents. But there are also other benefits of flexible work time. It would give us a cleaner environment as some people take the opportunity to live more simply and to cut back on consumerism in order to have more time. It would give us more jobs as employers hire new workers to backfill for those who choose shorter hours. It would give us a better quality of life because people could choose the work-life balance that's most satisfying for them. We're working on this initiative to get people talking about work-time flexibility. We think it will become common when people see its many benefits.